Hello students and welcome to today's government class. In the last class, we looked at the various arms of government. Before that, we looked at the various forms of definitions that we could have for government. We looked at it as an institution of the state. We looked at it as the art or process of governing. And then we looked at it as an academic field of study. We also looked at how the various functions or arms of government work together to ensure that the entire governing body is suitable to champion the citizens of a country, to prosperity. Today, we'll be looking at basic concepts of government. We're still under the elements of government, and there are very numerous concepts that we need to acclimatize ourselves with, such that we'll be able to understand what government is and how the governing process occurs. So first off, we'll be starting with power. Power, a very important concept. When you hear the word power, a lot of things come to mind. To put it in definition, we can define power as the capacity of an individual to affect other people's behavior by threat of sanction. Now, the key thing that separates power from any other similar concept is the threat of sanction. So we said by definition, power can be defined as the capacity. So the key word here is the capacity of an individual or group of individuals to affect people's behavior. We defined power as the capacity, right, of an individual or group of individuals to affect people's behavior or a person's behavior through the use or through the threat of sanction. Now, note that sanctions could be positive or negative. Oftentimes, when we think about power, we always think about it as, force. However, sanctions could actually be positive. It could just simply be, persuasion rather than force. So the one thing, as I mentioned, that separates power from other concepts in government is the threat of sanction. That threat of sanction is what separates it from people's willingness simply to just, obey or follow or allow their behaviors to be controlled. Now let's look at the forms of power that we have. Forms of power. We have one which is political power. Political power. What is political power? Here, this type of power is derived from the people and the constitution. By the people, here we call them electorates. They are called electorates because it is when the power to determine who occupies political position is vested in the voting public. So recall that I explained that the electorate are members of the public, that are of age or that are ready and available to vote. Also haven't gotten to the required age, which is usually 18 in Nigeria and varies in other countries. So for political power, this is a power that is derived from people as well as the constitution. Remember, we said the constitution is the law and no one is expected to be above it. So when we look at political power, we're saying this type of power is gotten from the people and is gotten from the constitution. For example, the governor of Lagos State, Babajide Sanwo-Olu, we can say that he has political power such that if protest is happening in a certain location, he has the right to tell them to stop or to leave them. Alternatively, we have another power called economic power. So we can put this here. This is derived from electorates and the constitution. Two, we have economic power. This is a very common type of power, just like political power. And it is where power is derived from the economic resources that are controlled by that individual or group of people. For example, we can say that someone like Otedola has power, regardless of the fact that he's not in any political position. If Otedola says something, it has value to drive market and drive people's behavior. That is because of the wealth of economic resources that he controls, and that also gives him, the capacity to influence or affect behavior. So we can define economic power as the power derived from the economic resources controlled by an individual. Next, we have what we call military power. This is very simple. This sort of power is vested in armed forces. For example, we have the army, which are soldiers on ground. We have navy, which are soldiers, on water or on the sea. And then we have the air forces, which are soldiers that are, that operate in the skies using airplanes and all of that. They are all regarded as armed forces. And military power is very much recognized in Nigeria and beyond. And that's why you see, if maybe there's traffic somewhere, a group of military men could come in and simply tell cars, move left, move right, and they must obey. Usually, we say that military power makes use of instruments of violence. It is a norm for military power to make use of instruments of violence. So we can define this third form of power, military power, as the power vested in armed forces, such as the army, navy, air force, air marshals, whatever, etc., and utilize instruments of violence. And that is why in most countries, the armed forces are the only ones that are, authorized to carry guns, carry weapons, and, they would not be asked for a warrant. Unlike individuals, where we carry a gun, you have to have a warrant. But for military officers, we associate their power to be vested in violence. You understand? The power that they have comes from the uniform. So it's a very, very unique type of power, and we can find that across countries. Finally, we have what we call physical power. Physical power. I'm sure this sounds like saying, oh, for you to be strong. Basically, we can define physical power, which is usually where the entire concept of power is derived from. It is the use of force to compel obedience. And that's why you can see some thugs come around, and regardless of the fact that they have no right to tell you as an individual to leave a particular place, but because of the fact that they can use force to compel your obedience, it is said that they have power over you. So we'll define physical power as the use of force to compel obedience. So now, amongst all of these, the most acceptable or unique forms are usually the first three. The fourth one is seen as coercion, and it's usually avoided. We've looked at the forms of power. Now we need to ask ourselves, what are the sources of power? Where does power originate from? So let's look at sources of power. Most of these forms of power usually have a source through which they originate from. And in the process of defining them, we've tried to, explain it. So one major source of power is the Constitution. The Constitution. Most of the duties, responsibility, and roles of political officers are recognized in the Constitution in detail. Even the roles of the various organs and arms of government are detailed in the Constitution. It means that whenever they act within, the confines of the Constitution, we can be said that their power is sourced from the Constitution. The Constitution is also where, the judiciary declares whether one has the capacity to behave in a certain manner. And that's why it's very important for you to familiarize yourself with the Constitution and see the powers that you can get from it, such that your actions must be legal and legitimate at all times. Another way you can source power is through coercion. This is very familiar. This is used by physical power holders and military power holders. Coercion is basically force, trying to make people do certain things that they would ordinarily not want to do. That's coercion. Persuasion. Either the fear of punishment would force them to do it, or just the fear of repercussions, maybe economic consequences that could come from it. Such coercion will cause them to give you the power that you may or may not deserve. Another way in which power is sourced is through charisma. Through charisma. Here, if a person is believed to, be intelligent or have a very charming charisma, you can be placed in a particular political position and be given some certain powers. Just like before Nelson Mandela became a political leader, he led his people, through liberation. And that's why it's important that we recognize this source of power through charisma. So we said this is based on intelligence or personality of person. What other ways can we source power? Power can be gotten through economic resources. So we have through economic resources. This is why the rich always want to get richer, because they know that money and property provides them with, a position of power that allows them dictate or influence people's behavior. So we can add this here. Money, properties. It's a very, very, very vital source of power. We see that in very many capitalist states. We could also have power that originates from a position of authority. So, from a position of authority. For example, because authority and power are very complementary. So if a person is in a position of authority, such a person can be said to have power. And that power is usually not entirely forced. However, if the occupier of that position chooses to use force, it would be as a result of that position of authority. So the position of authority that a person occupies can give them power. Finally, we have what we call inheritance. True inheritance. Power is hereditary. And that's why kings and queens of various royal families possess power, usually over maybe a community, a village, a state, or an entire nation, right? For example, the monarchy in England, right? The queen is said to have power, and that power is derived from inheritance. It is most likely automatic because it's a lineage thing, and maybe where one lineage dies, the power then moves to the next in line. So we see how power is very much related to authority, and thus it's important we understand what exactly authority is. So the next concept we'll be looking at is authority. Regardless of the fact that power and authority are very similar, authority can be defined as the formal and legal right to make and enforce laws or policies which citizens must obey. So we said this is defined as the formal and legal right. So the key words here are formal and legal. So we have the formal and legal right to make and enforce laws, to make and enforce laws, as well as policies which citizens must obey. So we're going to underline the keywords being formal, legal, it's a right, make and enforce laws, citizens must obey. So the key thing here that, sort of separates the definition for power and the definition for authority is the fact that acceptance is conferred on the people. So for power, most times, the people that, that the power influences or affects, they don't necessarily choose it. For example, beyond political power that is derived from the Constitution, maybe when a president appoints a minister or something, or appoints an elected officer, or appoints a public officer in a position, it means the people don't really have a right or say as to who gets there. However, because of the Constitution backing that power, they can't say no to it. On the other hand, authority underscores acceptance, which is conferred on the people. So now we need to look at what are the kinds of authority that exist. Kinds of authority. There are two major kinds of authority. We have the institutional authority, and then we have functional authority. So let's list them out. Institutional authority, and then we have functional authority. What is institutional authority? Here, we have group of individuals who legitimately occupy public offices with the capacity to determine public goals and policies. While functional authority, an individual or group accrue this type of authority as a result of the position that is held in an organization. So for institutional authority, it's more like forces have acted before the person gets to that position. So the person works towards acquiring the capacity to determine how they utilize that authority. But for functional authority, it is the position that the person occupies that accrues that authority. And that authority sort of conforms to accepted social norms. So we can put that in definition. Institutional authority. This is a group of people who, keyword here is legitimately, who legitimately occupy public offices who legitimately occupy public offices with the capacity to determine public goals and policies. So with the capacity to determine public goals and policies. So institutional authority, you see the person canvassing or preempting themselves to get into that position of authority. A good example would be a school principal or the head of state, like a president. On the other hand, functional authority this accrues as a result of the position that an individual or group of people hold within an organization. Held by an individual. This accrues as a result of the position held by an individual in an organization. So from the name, functional authority, the authority is derived from the function that the individual, possesses or exhibits. And that's why we said it is acceptable, or it conforms to acceptable social norms. Now, let's look at what are the sources of authority. We looked at sources of power, so there must also be sources of authority. So, sources. Sources of authority. There are 4 major sources of authority. We have 1, traditional authority. Traditional authority. As the name implies, this form of authority is derived from the customs and traditions of a particular people. For example, the authority conferred on an Oba, an Igwe, an Obi, an Emir. These are traditional authority sources and they are vested in traditional rulers. So we can simply define this source as derived from the customs and traditions of a people or a state or a community. Another source of authority is legal authority. And just like power, this